Hello all, thanks for joining us. I'm Tom Ferry with the Sports and Society program at the Aspen Institute, the home of Project Play. And welcome to the second event in our summer conversation series, all aimed at developing and pressure testing ideas that can be used to turn the crises we face today into opportunity and rebuild America with the help of community-based sports and recreation. The four-part series is broken into the 4 R's: recover, rebuild, reform, and resource. And the most promising ideas will be reflected in a Project Play platform for action that we take into this year's Project Play Summit in October. Think of a Democratic or Republican Party platform, except this one is nonpartisan, draws ideas from across our network of networks, and it's all about giving more kids an opportunity to play sports. Who could argue with that? We hope it serves as a resource to mobilize stakeholders to build healthier communities through sports, the mission of Project Play. The first event was on CAs and other providers who ordinarily serve kids at scale, but have seen major budget cuts since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. What do they need to survive in the next 12 to 18 months? Today's conversation is focused on infrastructure, which, it's fair to say, has always been the platform to grow access to sport in this country. Some quick history. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a cross-sector coalition built 2,000 parks and playgrounds in urban cities, laying the groundwork for youth sport as a tool of nation building. The next wave was propelled by the New Deal investments that got more than 10,000 athletic and recreational facilities built, everything from gyms to pools to rodeo venues. The third wave was aided by the Land and Water Conservation Act, introduced in 1965. It used proceeds from offshore drilling in the Gulf to help cities and counties develop recreation spaces. More than 40,000 such spaces came online, most of them by 1980, before much of the money was diverted to other federal priorities. The good news: Congress just restored full permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, $900 million a year, plus another $9.5 billion in maintenance catch-up needs at national parks. The president signed the landmark bill into law just yesterday. And to get more people back to work during the economic crisis, the White House and Congress are now talking about potentially investing trillions of dollars on infrastructure to fix up our broken bridges, roads, airports, and other items. If that bill were to include recreation infrastructure, newer revamped parks, fields, gyms, rinks, etc., plus trails and bike lanes, what would we as citizens and stakeholders, the Project Play Network, want? And how to make any investments sustainable, because we know that hardware needs software. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. We want you to participate in this conversation. You can do so in 3 ways. 1, through the chat function. Click the icon at the bottom of your screen to share your thoughts. Jennifer Brown Lerner will be hosting that part of the conversation and post related links. Q&A, click the icons to send questions to our panelists. And 3, participate in our live polls during the webinar. We will send a recap of the conversation, including the video recording after the webinar. We hope you share it on social with the hashtag Project Play and tag us at Aspen Inst Sports. I'm honored to be joined today by 4 panelists who will share their ideas. Each brings a unique perspective to the conversation and can help us think through the opportunities ahead. First, former NHL player Andrew Ference, who is now Director of Social Impact, Growth Initiatives, and Legislative Affairs at the NHL. Rhonda Jackson, Senior Advisor of Government Affairs at Kaboom, which works with municipal agencies to build playgrounds, parks, and other play spaces. JJ Tai, Director of the Parks and Trails Initiative at the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, which is investing deeply in recreation spaces in Southeast Michigan and Western New York, and has invested more in youth sports probably than any foundation in the past few years. John Bridgeland, who is the founder and CEO of the public policy firm Civic, as well as Vice Chair of the Service Year Alliance. He was the White House domestic policy chief under George W. Bush and also served in the Obama administration. He can talk about how to leverage national service to recruit more youth coaches. So let's start with you, Rhonda. Welcome. how would you characterize the state of playgrounds and other community spaces, other play spaces for children in this country right now?
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. Yeah, the state of playgrounds in this country is similar to the state of the rest of our infrastructure, which is in disrepair and inequitable. And a lot of those inequities exist because of decades of policies and practices that were racialized and that really left communities of color isolated and economically distressed, really without the access to those basic public amenities like playgrounds and swimming pools and recreation centers. And unfortunately, in 2020, so many of those inequities still exist. And Black and brown children living in low wealth communities don't really have the access to the quality play spaces and recreation opportunities and sports opportunities that their white counterparts have. And we're really concerned that COVID is really only going to increase these disparities.
Yeah. So what kind of play spaces in particular, Rhonda, or do we need right now, and versus those that we built in the past?
Well, the ones that we believe we need right now are the play spaces that Kaboom and our partners are building. And first of all, they're play spaces that are fun and challenging for teens and older kids, like our Ninja Warrior style playgrounds that we started building last year. Playgrounds that really incorporate the latest digital technology and virtual technology into the playground experience. Playgrounds and play spaces that also are a part of a city's resiliency strategy, which is really important now. And ways that you can do that is by putting playful elements into stormwater mitigation projects. And lastly, really now more than ever, playgrounds need to be safe. And recently, Kaboom, in partnership with the CDC and some other national organizations, have put out guidelines for reopening playgrounds safely in light of COVID-19.
Yeah. So what are the best opportunities on the table right now to rebuild or build that infrastructure through government funding? Maybe you can, because I know you're deep in the weeds on this, but maybe you can walk us through the bills that are being considered or coalition efforts that are forming.
Yeah, I'm definitely deep in the weeds, and I'm going to walk and geek out here with you for a few minutes. But the three that we're paying close attention to are the Great American Outdoors Act, which you talked about earlier, the Rebuilding America's School Act, and also the Highway Trust Fund reauthorization bill. So we'll start with the Great American Outdoors Act. As you said, great news. The president signed it yesterday into law. It had tremendous bipartisan support and will really put together $9 billion in 5 years, to make sure that the backlog maintenance in our national parks, if anybody's been to a national park lately, they know that that is a concern, can be repaired. It will also create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. So we're definitely really excited about that. And a key element of that is the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program. And that program provides funding to cities and states who are interested in rebuilding their infrastructure in parks and recreation for communities that are in high need, and also for communities that have less access to park space and that also are really impacted by climate change. Next, there is the Rebuilding America's School Act, which I think is important for those that care about young people, care about our youth. That is being really pushed, and we are a part of the group that's supporting that, called the BASIC Coalition. And the Rebuilding America's School Act is $130 billion to rebuild and fix our public school facilities that are really in disrepair. This will also really focus on high need communities and schools that have had infrastructure problems for a long time. This will make sure that educators and teachers, when it's right to go back to school, will have the facilities that they need and will create 2 million new jobs. And lastly, the Highway Trust Fund reauthorization bill is going to expire on September 30th. And usually when that bill expires, it creates opportunity for other investment in infrastructure around the nation.
Got it. And so how do you handicap a likelihood of any of them passing. Obviously, you got to do something about the transportation bill. The Great, the Atlanta Water Conservation Fund. That's done. What about the other? What about the schools bill? And schools are really important because it's not just schools, but community recreation organizations use those spaces on weekends and after school to conduct their programming as well. How do you handicap the likelihood of that one?
Yeah, I do really feel some optimism about the Rebuilding America Schools Act. It will create, hopefully, some outdoor facility improvement for schools around the country. And what I would say is in the HILls Act that Congress is in the process of negotiating now, there is money for the Rebuilding America School Act. It's not as much as we had wanted and as many schools needed, but it's there. And I'm very optimistic that that portion is going to go through. I want to go back a little bit to the Land, Water, and Conservation Bill, because even though that funding has been signed, the Outdoor Recreation and Legacy Program, that $100 million in that program annually for local parks, it does have some restrictions around kind of matching dollars that city and states need. And given how much city and states are really struggling right now financially, we would love for some of that matching requirements to be eliminated or lessened to make it easier for city and states to tap into that funding. And then as far as highway reauthorization, yes, it's got to happen. I hope that, the promises that are being made about more infrastructure coming out of that in the fall will happen. I am concerned about the election and that there's so much funding coming out right now from Congress if that additional infrastructure investment will happen in the fall, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm. And what about with the schools? Are there restrictions around what can be spent in the school? I mean, could it go toward gyms and play spaces, or is it all restricted to, traditionally academic spaces?
I mean, what we're pushing for and what's in some of the language of the letters that have gone to Congress and in some of the language of the bill is that there is discretion for the entire school facility, which would mean the outside of the building. So I think there are some opportunities there.
Gotcha. So finally, I mean, when we talk about infrastructure, again, it's usually roads and bridges and airports. How to best make the argument? How to get this over the finish line? Get these various efforts over the finish line? How do you make the argument for sports and recreation? How do you do it when you're knocking on doors?
So Kaboom is a part of this newly funded coalition called the Nonprofit Infrastructure Investment Group. We're co-leading that with independent sector. And our aim is to really make sure to make the case to Congress that when they think about rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, when they think about putting people back to work, that they're thinking about more than roads and bridges, but that they're really investing dollars in the nonprofit sector, in local government, to make sure that we're strengthening civic bonds, that we're delivering equitable outcomes for communities of color that have been brutally impacted by this pandemic, and that we're making it easier for city and states to work together. So we look at two buckets. We look at community infrastructure, which are those things that are the great public assets that all communities need, like parks and playgrounds and sports and recreation facilities, and then also civic infrastructure that's really important to, make sure that we support the society and the things that really knit together the bonds of our nation, like the census, like voting, like charitable giving, like volunteering, really to make sure that that is considered when we think about investing in the infrastructure of this country.
Gotcha. Okay, so then I asked each of our panelists here to make three asks. What are the three things you would want to see that you would argue for to be in the Project Play platform for action, this document that we will produce in advance of the and bring into the Project Play Summit? And so these are Rhonda's ideas here. I'll just read them real quickly, and you covered some of them, but not all of them. So I'll come back to you in a moment here after we run through them. First one is triple the size of the Outdoor Recreation and Legacy Program from 100 million to 300 million. And use the funds to include youth sports and recreation programs. The second, increase the funding for the CORE Act and National Service. Tell us a little bit about that. What's your idea there?
The idea is that, there's so many wonderful things within the national service. There's senior service, there's youth service, but what I would love to have is money within national service funding that provides internships or stipends for youth living in low-income communities to really support those sports and recreation programs that often need additional staff, but, to be able to provide dollars for that. So that I think would be great, just that there's a national service for sports and recreation programs in cities throughout the country.
Great. And anything to add on the third bullet point there about Choice Neighborhoods program?
So Choice Neighborhoods program is a wonderful program that really helps to rebuild our national housing system, our public housing system. But what often happens is that there isn't money set aside for recreation, for sports facilities within public housing, even though we know that there's a lot of kids and families living in the nation's public housing. So I would propose an additional $300,000 or $500,000 for that all of those choice neighborhoods have the type of outdoor recreation space and rec programs that are needed for folks living in our national public housing system.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Rhonda. Thank you for being such a policy geek on this stuff. It's super important.
Thanks, Tom.
I really love it. This is actually how things get done, is people like you knowing the details and pushing for them in all the right places. So we're going to bring you back in a few minutes, but I'd like to bring in JJ right now to talk to us about the Wilson Foundation and their efforts. So yeah, welcome, JJ. I'm familiar with your work. The Wilson Foundation is a partner of Project Play. We've done a lot of work on state of play stuff, helping organize efforts, inform efforts in those regions. But how do you assess the need for sports and recreation infrastructure in the regions where you work?
Great, thanks, Tom, and good morning, everyone. These spaces are very important to our communities. Parks and trails provide opportunities for sports and recreation, but they also provide opportunities, I think, for civic engagement, economic development, and even for transportation. I think the value has really been highlighted during these challenging times during the pandemic, whether it's for exercise or even just a little bit of respite from the stresses that we're all facing every day. And we're seeing it. The demand that we're hearing from our partners, up 200, 300% from what's normal for these spaces. But this has undoubtedly provided or put some stress and pressure on those that operate and maintain these spaces. So access and quality of those spaces does vary throughout the region. I think based on this increased usage and the corresponding maintenance, plus COVID safety protocols, social distancing and programming, and all during a time when there's significant local fiscal challenges and increased concern over employee safety, it's really created some truly complex challenges for our partners. And for those that are in the audience today that are maintaining those spaces, I just really want to say thank you.
Yeah. So what is the Wilson Foundation doing to address these gaps in particular? Maybe you want to show us a couple of your slides here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's broken down into two time horizons. First, in the short term, we're really focused on working with our grantees for COVID response, right? It's making sure that the capacity of these organizations is solid. I think in the moderate to longer term, a focus on or reinforcement of our commitment to parks and trails, because we see that demand. In October of 2018, on what would have been Mr. Wilson's 100th birthday, we made a $200 million commitment to these regions. So $100 million in Western New York and $100 million in Southeast Michigan. And you can see on the chart here, this kind of shows our investments in Southeast Michigan. This shows the regional trail system. The gray lines are 7 regional trails throughout the 7 counties that we're focused on. And you can see the orange lines that are on this chart that shows the trail gaps that we are focused on eliminating in communities across the region. In addition, the dots that are on the map represent our investments in parks, in trail gateways to increase access, in playgrounds, in skate parks, and other sports and recreation investments throughout the region. But I think what's important to highlight here is, we are focused on the system rather than just the individual projects. how do these connect a community? How do you connect recreational assets, cultural assets, and connect neighborhoods to these assets? And also, I think it's about the funding framework. We just talked about, and Rhonda highlighted a lot of the federal resources that are out there. The focus that we have, our focus has really been on capacity, early work for design and engineering of these spaces, which isn't typically covered by some of those sources, and then the critical match funding. Some of these communities do not have the resources to be able to provide that match, so do not have access to those other federal sources that were just mentioned. The other piece, and I'd highlight if you go to the next slide, it's very similar in Western New York. We have 4 major regional trails: the Genesee Valley Greenway, the Empire State Trail, and the Shoreline Trail, and then all of those other investments. But I want to highlight what's not on the map. We, as part of our commitment of $200 million, we set aside 20%, $40 million, $20 million in each region for the sustainability of these spaces so that they're preserved for future generations to use. And I think it's generated a conversation amongst other funders and in the communities on how best to handle these life cycle costs. And I think that provides an opportunity to discuss that maintenance funding or that long-term funding with some of these federal opportunities going forward.
You mentioned the trails and how they connect different assets and neighborhoods, and that's what I think is kind of cool about your project. Is you're very aware of where skate parks are and basketball courts are, and then talk to me a little bit more about how your theory on how to connect all that together.
Yeah, I think the built environment is so important. I think making the healthy choice, the easy or the convenient choice is really important. These parks and trails, playgrounds, athletic fields, if they're accessible, if they're safe, and if they're inviting, people are going to use them, and we can collectively have a real profound impact on our communities. That infrastructure really becomes a means to an ends. We can use it to walk, bike, to play sports, but it really becomes a conduit to better health, safer transportation, and economic development, and really achieve some broader outcomes in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, and maybe is the idea too with trails and greenways is that, you know, maybe kids don't have to be like driven everywhere by their parents. They can just hop on their bike. It begins to solve the transportation challenge, which is emerged as a challenge in every single community that we have gone into and assessed the state. Absolutely. I think we were talking about some of the federal, transportation component here. Yeah. The federal transportation reauthorization, that funding is absolutely essential. We have approached this work by making a significant commitment in each of the regions, but we are not going to do this alone. The communities that we support are not going to do it alone. That support from the state and federal level is absolutely critical. We want, with this commitment, to allow communities to dream big, but the confidence that they have with the opportunity for that matching funds and for those state and federal opportunities really allow them to achieve that great vision. I think the funding framework that we're focused on, that design and engineering and that match funding, really will allow these communities to achieve that better outcome. So I think the federal transportation bill that Rhonda mentioned, the FAST Act that'll be up for reauthorization this year, that funds things like our recreation transportation program, transportation alternatives program, congestion mitigation and air quality programs at a tune of nearly $850 million a year. Those are the major drivers to build these assets in our communities and are absolutely essential. And I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight some of the state commitments too, like the Empire State Trail in New York, the Iron Belt Trail Initiative in Michigan Department of Natural Resources Trust Funds. They all are part of that funding fabric that bring these things to life in a community. But again, I think one thing to highlight that's missing is a consistent source of funding for maintenance or redevelopment of these assets. I think a lot of these federal and even state sources are focused on building them. I think we need to have a tougher discussion up front
when we start to build these on how they're going to be maintained and how communities can handle the life cycle cost of these to make sure they're accessible for everybody in a neighborhood, and also are there for future generations.
Yep. We talked about the land and water conservation funding a little bit earlier in the webinar. Again, it's gotten more than 40,000 recreation spaces built in my lifetime. With the full funding restored, I mean, what does that provide? Where do you see opportunities to build play spaces with that money?
Well, first, I just want to reiterate, let's take a second to celebrate. It's a big win for all of these communities and their ability to take care of and build these assets across the United States. I think that what we have seen, that funding has been utilized just recently, an announcement for part of the funding for a park on the waterfront in Buffalo, which I know the city relied heavily on. And it's just a great win as part of that broader funding package. But I think the one thing that, again, I would highlight is layered into that is a really important precedent. And that's the set aside for maintenance and getting at the backlog of maintenance at our national parks. And I think that provides an acknowledgement and a great start to change the dialogue on sustainability funding as we look at the federal transportation bill and other things that are coming down. I think that's a really important dialogue to continue, and a really, really nice precedent.
Great, terrific. Well, again, we asked JJ, like all the other speakers, to make 3 asks to be considered in the Project Play platform for action. And these are his, and he covered most of them here. Lean in and dedicated funding for parks and trails, build a leverage funding framework that's hard to say no to, and dedicate 20% or more of your investment to sustainability, which you just covered. Anything in there, JJ, that needs further fleshing out?
I think the one thing that I would highlight is that middle bullet, that leverage funding framework. It's match resources in a community where philanthropy can jump in and support when these federal resources and state resources are available. But I think along with that vision that's generated through genuine community engagement in a community and the collaboration amongst partners to really align outcomes to achieve that vision, and then ultimately is easy to support, I think is the message here.
Gotcha. Terrific. All right. Well, thank you, JJ. Stick around for the Q&A. I'd like to bring in Andrew Ferens from the NHL now. Andrew, first of all, congratulations on the NHL's project with the Red Wings in Detroit. 30,000 kids touching the game in some form or another, floor hockey or otherwise, working with the schools. It was just announced in March. Terrific. Hockey Town, you're really helping it live up to, the city live up to its name. Excellent. Let me ask you, what's the state of community rinks and youth hockey around the country, especially as a result of COVID-19?
Well, I wish I could be cheerful about it, but it's definitely not great. I'm a little bit more versed, obviously, on the north side of the border up here in Canada, but I know that the two countries actually line up very similarly with infrastructure. A lot of the building was done around the same times. A lot of the investments were made around the same times. So while we have a few more rinks up here, the ages of them and the state of them are actually quite similar. Right now, we know that about 19% of rinks are 50 years old plus. 35% of rinks are between 31 and 49 years old, and 17% are between over 21 years old. So basically, when you break that down, 71% of our rinks are over 21 years old, with a big chunk of those well past their expected life expectancy, or past their life expectancy. Up here in Canada, we have a lot more government statistics on the state of rinks, just because a lot of those rinks are municipally owned. We have over 5,000 rinks, indoor and outdoor, up here in Canada. 98% of them are municipally owned. So obviously the big differences between the two countries is the privately owned rinks south of the border in the States, and up here, publicly owned rinks. the government obviously cares about their investments, and so they have a lot more data that we can use up here in Canada. And we know that the reinvestment rate up here in Canada is only 1.3%, and the stated need for reinvestment is over $9 billion to replace the rinks that are in very poor condition or poor condition. So those really old, dilapidated rinks that will shut down because of safety reasons or mechanical failure, probably sooner than later. So $9 billion need, and we're nowhere near close to that with the funding that's coming through.
Yep, and I want to talk to you more about how Canada is addressing here in a minute. Before we do so, I want to introduce a live poll to our crowd, and please vote in this thing. The question is, what recreation infrastructure would you most like to see more of in your community? Would it be athletic facilities, meaning fields and gyms and rinks, et cetera? Would it be recreational venues, pools, municipal golf courses, tennis courts, et cetera? And this is, by the way, it's certainly not an exhaustive list of all the potential assets that would fall under each of these buckets. But parks, whether it be large parks, pocket parks, neighborhood parks, whatever else it may be. Is it trails and bike lanes? Is it playgrounds, or is it other assets? And we ask you to vote in this thing, knowing full well that you might want to check all of them, if not many of them. So whoever the winner is here doesn't mean that we're suggesting the others are not deserving of investment. But let's just get a sense of the enthusiasm people have for certain types of recreational, assets that are out there. So Andrew, let's go back to you. So how is Canada addressing its facilities problem versus the U.S.?
Yeah, so with the majority being publicly owned facilities, there is an infrastructure plan put out by the federal government every year, or almost every year. And the current plan has $1.3 billion in a bucket of money that goes towards community, culture, and recreation facilities. So the bucket's not specifically for arenas and sports facilities in particular, but that $1.3 billion can be accessed by municipalities and provinces as a way of matching funds to reinvest in the rinks. So it seems like a lot of money, but $1.3 billion over 10 years compared to a $9 billion need right now, you can obviously see the massive gap that exists. And so, we're really trying to push for more dedicated funding specifically towards recreation facilities, without having to share a bucket with museums and other cultural centers that also have great need. But we're seeing that recreation facilities aren't being prioritized by municipalities, and so it's one thing to have money sitting there ready to access as matched funds, but the initial funds aren't coming through in the first place by municipalities to be matched. And so, there's a bit of a conundrum there, right? Recreation facilities at the moment, are a bit of a drain on the budget books for municipalities. They are, if you have a 50-plus-year-old facility, the energy bill on that thing's not going to look so hot. It's going to eat up a pretty big line item on your municipal budget, and you probably won't have a great view of what a recreation facility looks like on your books. So we're a bit fighting against the stigma of that. And so another way that we are as the NHL going forward is working with some fantastic engineering groups that are building net zero rinks. And so the new generation of hockey rinks that can be built net zero, obviously, you're capturing all the waste heat, you're generating your own power on site, and really fantastic facilities. So when we look at reinvesting and rebuilding, it's doing it in a new modern way, not just building the same old facility that, like I said, was not a particularly fun line item to look at, when you're doing the budget.
Yeah. And what are the barriers to addressing these facilities deficits? I mean, you covered a little. Is it just politics? Is it a matter of making the case for the value of sports? So what is it? How do we?
Honestly, I think we've had this conversation before, and I'll preach on this topic. I think it's all three of my bullet points are on this, but it's how we value sport. It really is. I think it comes down to, what does sport give us? And I spent a bit of time within government, within our provincial funding arm, for youth sports when I retired from the NHL. And the way we measured success was about medals. How did we do at the Canada Winter Games? You know, how many Olympic athletes came out of this? How did our elite sport team perform at this competition? It's ludicrous. It really is. If we're measuring sport based on the outcomes of the elite athletes, it's absolutely crazy. We don't truly value what sport is. And so when I look at sport, the reason why it's so important for our government is how does it help us in other areas where we're spending money? Obviously, up in Canada, it's a much easier case to make with public health care. You know, our provinces, dedicate over half of their budget towards public health care. A lot of those diseases are preventable through good recreation and fitness at a young age, right? And good habits and active youth. So the fact that we wouldn't invest in the direct line to making sure our youth are more active and have easy access to those facilities and to those good programs is crazy. It's an investment in our health, in our public health care. It's an investment in our education system because we know that kids that are involved in sport are getting better grades. And it's an investment in keeping kids out of the justice system, which we also know is true. And so you look at those three factors alone. I don't hear many politicians and I don't hear many people talking about that being the value of sports. That's why we need to reinvest in these facilities. That's why we need to make sure that every kid has access to sport. It's not so they can, have a good time and, maybe make the NHL or, get a medal. Like those are great outcomes. Those are fun. Those are good stories, but that's not why we invest in sports as a community. So I think that's probably the biggest barrier is just, how we're framing the reason why we're doing all this, the reason why we care about sports.
Yeah, yeah. And in the NHL, can the NHL do this alone? I mean, who's the coalition? Who are the groups that need to, mobilize together with you to make this case and around these policy issues?
Well, if there's a $9 billion need, I've been in my budget meeting. I'm not getting that that kind of line item. So I mean, look, our foundations do great work. Our club foundations. You touched on what Detroit has done within their community. We have foundations across all of our club cities. We have an industry growth fund that we've established with our union, which has tens of millions of dollars. It's great. It does as much as it can. But the big investment has to come, at the federal, provincial, or state levels. It's a massive investment. The need is there. Much like our bridges and roads and all that other infrastructure, it's been left too long. And now there's the bill's there to be paid if we want to reinvest in these things. And so there really is no way to do that other than through a public policy that puts an emphasis on the value of sport and the value that it provides, like I said, to those other parts of our budget.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's show Andrew's 3 points, three arguments for inclusion in the Project Play platform, and he really did cover those. So I'll run through them really quickly. One is have government entities identify access to sport and recreation as a basic human right and essential to the sectors of health, education, and the justice system. Have established values placed on recreation and sport facilities based on the value that sport brings to the sectors of health, education, and the justice system. What's it worth in our communities and countries to have X more people involved in sport and recreation? And thirdly, measure the success of the sport system and government contribution to that system based upon the metrics of health, education, and justice, as opposed to, as Andrew just talked about, Olympic and national level success. So just a reminder to our network, we have created some resources that can help you make this case, begin to go this direction. One would be our Active Kids Do Better in Life infographic, which we just updated a couple of weeks ago to add data related to mental health. Shows that kids who play sports are 1/10 as likely to be obese, more likely to stay in school, more likely to go to college, more likely to get good jobs coming out of college, less likely to have chronic disease, and more likely to be active parents. And therefore, they end up being better role models for their kids. So they have more active kids. It's not rocket science. We just got to get kids physically active at an early age. This is what the research says happens. Feel free to grab this resource and distribute it as widely as possible with whatever stakeholder groups you find to be useful to talk with. Second of all, we created a whole new infographic called Active Communities Do Better. what the research shows on the benefits to residents. So from a public health and property value standpoint, what happens when communities invest in sports? We went and looked at the fittest cities in the U.S. according to the American College of Sports Medicine, and then began to connect it to other data showing that people smoke less and property values go up, and all these wonderful things happen if mayors and city managers and governors help them invest in sports at the local level. So distribute. We hope that's useful. So thanks. Appreciate that, Andrew. Let's bring you back in here in a few minutes, but I want to bring in John now, John Bridgeland, whose friends seem to all call him Bridge. I don't know you well enough yet, so I feel like I can call you Bridge, John. But maybe we'll get there eventually. So John, how does national service fit into the conversation about infrastructure and workforce development?
Sure. So Tom, thank you so much for having me. And it's so great to see JJ and Rhonda and Andrew all together in one place. So we all should be where Andrew is, though, in terms of beauty. So it's so interesting. National service got its start in America, focused on infrastructure and workforce development. Franklin Roosevelt called Congress into emergency session during the Great Depression. And within literally a couple of months, they had 250,000 young unemployed men working in our parks and public lands. Over the course of the program, it's just remarkable. 3 million young unemployed men had planted 3 billion trees, preserved 84 million acres of land, which is equivalent to our entire acreage of the national park system today. Created 800 parks, national, state, and local, and saved a generation from festering in the streets and poverty. And so national service really is at the center right now, post-COVID, when we have record levels of youth unemployment. We've actually been pressing the Congress to do a bold act with passage of the CORE Act and increase national service positions to get young people, pulling the wagon instead of riding in it, frankly, giving something back to their community and country at a time of national crisis, and then connecting that extraordinary service experience to the needs of the nation, which of course, as you've highlighted in this program already, relate to infrastructure and keeping the workforce pipeline strong.
Yep. So John, what are the basics of national service, right? I mean, the term, the host, the funding, the impact. I mean, I think we've got several slides.
Yeah, thanks to my friend Jennifer Brown Lerner, we have some good slides. So it's a great tradition growing out of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then of course John Kennedy's Peace Corps and Johnson's Vista, Nixon's Senior Corps. And today we have about 75,000 opportunities every year for young and old alike to do a year or more of national service through, unless it's the Peace Corps, which is a federal government program only. AmeriCorps is the domestic counterpart to the Peace Corps. It's funded by an independent federal agency called the Corporation for National Community Service, which actually attracts private sector investment to match the public sector. And it's really encouraging. They invest about $1.2 billion a year from the federal government, and the private sector more than matches that investment. And the program runs through these three programs. It's called AmeriCorps State and National, where the funds flow through either national directs to nonprofit organizations like Teach for America or Rhonda, the wonderful Kaboom program, and others, City Year, that have sites across the country, or through state service commissions that give out grants to nonprofits in their states. There's AmeriCorps NCCC, which is a residential program mostly focused on disaster preparedness and response. And then, of course, AmeriCorps Vista, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute.
Right. So you'll get, what's the next slide here? Vista.
Yeah, so AmeriCorps Vista, again, it was created during the War on Poverty to bring capacity, human capital, to nonprofit and organizations that need it to address the war on poverty. You can be, in terms of service, it's a 1-year service opportunity for young people 18 years of age or older. So imagine someone graduating from high school and then doing a gap or bridge year, or after you finish college or beyond, serving in these programs. You get a living stipend paid for by the federal government and matched at some level by the private sector. President Clinton said, if you invest in your country, we'll invest in you. So you get an education award at the end of your service, which given the debt crisis and student loan crisis in this country is just critical. Housing, and then you get this wonderful support through an alumni network. It's not the federal government running these programs. The power of it, and Rhonda touched on this, was the strength of our civil society. So it's through local nonprofits, agencies, facilities are well known by neighborhoods and communities, and really reflect Indigenous needs. And the impact, which we can talk about more in a minute, or really depends on the nature of the program, but across all of them, it gets to economic mobility for those who are served. For those serving, it has multiple effects in terms of really understanding deeply problems in communities and neighborhoods, being able to work with people who are different from you. I talk about particularly now in our polarized times, bringing people who are Black, white, brown, rich, poor, different geographies, different faiths, different politics, to work in common purpose is a big idea to heal the country.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is where it gets exciting to me. And I know it's exciting to you because you've actually, you put skin in the game in this. Tennis for America, applying the national service model to develop, I'll let you take it here. What is Tennis for America?
So I was a ball boy. I was a tennis player in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was a ball boy for Arthur Ashe. And he took the time to hit with a group of us after his incredible match against Stan Smith that he had won. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Ashe, what got you into tennis, and what are you doing with it now other than winning all these tournaments? And he said, I was mentored by Richard Hudlin in Richmond, Virginia, and now I'm mentoring Juan Farrow, this kid from a poor area of Richmond, and he turned out to be the #1 tennis player, Juan did, in our age bracket. And so that always stuck with me, because tennis and basketball and football and baseball for me completely changed my life on so many levels. And so just a couple of years ago, I proposed this idea that called Tennis for America, where college tennis players who were good enough to play in college, but not probably good enough to go on the pro tour right away, would be given an opportunity to give back a year of their lives after college, or it could be after high school as a bridge year. They get a living stipend through the AmeriCorps Vista program. In this case, they get an education award at the end of their service. There are quite a few people who are stepping up to offer host homes for these Tennis for America Corps members, but they also get a housing allowance. And then we've placed these Tennis for America fellows in 4 sites, with Ray Benton in College Park, Maryland, in the South Bronx at the New York Junior Tennis and Learning Center, Carrie Leeds, Sloan Stevens Foundation out in Compton, California, and Excess Tennis in Chicago, Illinois, which Billie Jean King and all these fancy, iconic tennis players are very supportive of. And basically, Tom, these TFA members, and it's a wonderfully diverse group of young, inspired tennis players who are reaching deeply into the communities through these nonprofit tennis facilities to reach young people who are poor, where Lifeline could be not only discipline and all the wonderful qualities you mentioned in terms of what it gives to them, but also they get tutoring and mentoring and opportunities eventually to leverage tennis to get into college. They create a network to get jobs. And it's just such a powerful idea, I think, to marry sport with national service. And it's really the first time the country's invested in such an idea.
Yeah, the nice thing about the national service, it does seem to have bipartisan support to some degree, yes?
Yes, very much so. Actually, both President Bushes were strongly behind national service. President Reagan actually created and funded the California Conservation Corps under the oddly inspiring motto, low pay, miserable conditions, hard work, and all these people signed up. It's just, typically American, right? Always wanting to do more and to give back. And so we think, just based, this is the pilot year. I've got my Tennis for America jacket on. And I'm interacting with these extraordinary young people almost every week, and the stories they share. Some are going in to start new tennis programs for high schools that don't have them. Some are literally helping the facilities to use their internet more effectively, to reach more people, or to be more effective and efficient in their programming. And they're all, tutoring and mentoring young people living in poverty who now have a lifeline called tennis.
Yeah, definitely. All right, let's pull up Bridges. We've talked long enough. I can call you Bridge now. Let's pull up Bridges 3 point, 3 points for the platform for action. And I want you to expand upon one of those there. One is your asks are scale tennis for America, a human capital solution to expand capacity for Project Play from 4 pilot sites in year 1 to 25 in year 2 and 50 in year 3. Second is engage other sports to pilot test similar models. Soccer, lacrosse, basketball for America. And third is foster partnership between the Service Alliance and Project Play to ensure models advance Project Play goals. Well, thank you. I appreciate the interest in working with us, and we're happy to kind of help you figure this out. But talking about the second bullet point here, I mean, can this thing be scaled across other sports? I mean, we have a lot of folks in our network who are tied to particular, single sport organizations.
It absolutely can. The energy we've seen both from the private sector and the federal government to support it has been really encouraging. So the funding can be there, and we're working right now, as Rhonda mentioned, to scale up national service opportunities from about 75,000 a year, hopefully up to 250,000 or more. Our goal is eventually 1 million a year. It's also, I want to talk to Andrew about hockey for America, and Larry Scott, who's a tennis player. We both played tennis at the same college, and now he's head of the Pac-12. He's very interested in, taking the Tennis for America model and expanding it to soccer for America, football for America, lacrosse for America. You get the idea. And when you think about it, literally tens of thousands of national service members deployed across the country to increase the capacity of so many organizations and facilities that are connected to sport, to connect that love of sport and all that brings to an individual, to literally millions of kids across the country, is a big idea. And the chair of our Service Year Alliance is 4-star General Stanley McChrystal, and he's very firm about goals and achievements and results. And so we're following this Tennis for America model very closely, and hope that you'll help us bring it to other sports, Tom.
Well, I love it, and we do recognize within Project Play the great need, as does JJ, I know from the Wilson Foundation. I mean, there's just a great need for capacity, even if you have resources. Who's going to deploy it? So recruiting new talent into the delivery of community-based recreation that's affordable and high quality. I think this is absolutely part of the fix. So, all right, let's bring everybody back here and take a few questions from the audience before we go. So, Jennifer, anything?
Hi, actually, we've had a lot of great questions, and I'm sorry we don't have time to get to more of them. But I do think that the questions all spoke to a particular theme. The funding that comes from the Great Outdoors Act, Land and Water Conservation Act, is going to be passed through the municipal side and the school side, but a lot of the people in our audience are in the private sector. So I'm going to start this question, I think, for Andrew, and then others are welcome to join in. Do you know any success stories in creating athletic facilities or community centers through public-private partnerships, and what role can other private organizations play in this great rebuild of infrastructure?
Well, for sure. I mean, there's all kinds of mixes of hockey rinks out there for sure, and there are actually some publicly built facilities that have been overtaken by private operators. Both I think I know in my old neighborhood in Boston, but also up here in Canada as well. And the private operators, if you wanted to be very stereotypical, they do run them, a probably better business model on the whole. They're obviously driven to, maximize their profits and fill ice time and really, make it work, right? They have their own money on the line. So, there's definitely examples. And I think that when we see access to government money, though, there are restrictions placed on how that can operate. I know that tied to the federal money and the provincial money up here, if you want to get public funding, you have to operate as a nonprofit. And so our foundations can help bring infrastructure money. Say the Montreal Canadiens Foundation, they've been building outdoor refrigerated rinks across Montreal. They can build those, but they can't operate them as a for-profit center. So there are strings attached if you're using government money this side of the border.
Rhonda, I noticed you smiling and nodding. Do you have thoughts about how the private sector can be more involved?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely, with the help of many corporations that support Kaboom's work and also the Wilson Foundation, the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation, we were able to build a bunch of amazing large-scale play spaces in Detroit and in Western New York in partnership with, several, the Ford Motor Company and other corporations, and combined, that was really a great moment. But, in this country, those playgrounds that we built were run by park and rec systems, but they were built through public-private partnerships.
I think we might have time for one last question, and this one was for JJ. The work that the Wilson Foundation is doing in Southeast Michigan and Western New York is fantastic. But how can communities that don't have a Wilson Foundation start the project of rebuilding their public spaces?
I think we have been very fortunate being able to work in two great regions and in great communities. I think having that vision for whether it be a park or a trail or a recreation facility or an athletic field is the start, and then sharing that vision and showing how partners can get involved to achieve that vision, alongside the federal funding that we've talked about, but showing how you can be part of that fabric to achieve that vision, I think is absolutely necessary. And it really goes back to the leadership and the folks that are passionate about these spaces and communities in our region and then anywhere, I think, in the United States.
Thanks, JJ. And I'm looking at the clock time. I think that might have been all the time we have.
Yep, good. All right, well, thank you. Listen, I want to thank all of our panelists and our team, Jennifer, Fumi, John, Emily, Marty, Rania, and to you, our Project Play Network. Your participation in this session, your comments, and your feedback will help us shape the ideas that get included in the Project Play platform for action that we will introduce later this fall. The next event in our summer conversation series is August 26th on the reform we need now. Fundamental flaws in the governance model of youth sports and sports at the grassroots level, period, regarding access, health and safety standards, and otherwise, have been laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic. More accountability, we recognize, can help address many challenges in our sport delivery system. But how best to achieve that from the national to the state to the local levels? Please join us for that conversation as we further shape the Project Play platform for action. Then join us for the Project Play Summit itself on October 13th through 16th, where virtually we will help mobilize our network around the most promising ideas in the platform. And finally, please, a reminder to sign up for our newsletter. That's where we will be sharing upcoming webinars, as well as reports and essential resources to help leaders, coaches, and parents navigate these uncertain times. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media at Aspen Sports for the latest on our Project Play reports, as well as news and other resources. So thank you all. Play safe, keep innovating, and see you next time.